Appreciate that. Good to see everybody tonight, as always, and hope our discussion as we begin a new study. We're going to study the book of James beginning tonight, and as always, invite your thoughts, your comments. I think it'll really be a good study. I put a lot of time into it the last 3 or 4 or 5 weeks trying to gather a lot of information, background information. And as we study it, I've got 4 commentaries that I'm using. One was Albert Barnes. I printed out his entire commentary on James, which is 120 pages. I'm not going to read all 120 pages during the next few weeks, but I'll refer to it quite a bit. I'm using B.W. Johnson. His was not nearly as long. His was probably 10 or 12 pages, B.W. Johnson. Using Wayne Jackson. I didn't print his out, but I'll be referring to it from time to time and using his book from time to time. He has some really good comments in some of the things, and all of them have not that they have a little different slant, but they give a little information that maybe the other one didn't. And so I'll try to fill in the blanks with some of those. And also Nelson's commentary they have a really good commentary on the book of James as well. So I'll be using those as we go through. The book is only 108 verses. In that 108 verses, there are 54 commands, which kind of surprised me. I didn't count them up, but I'm relying on a couple of the commentaries that mentioned that there are 54 commands in the book of James. A very practical book, as we know. It's not a doctrinal book, but it's a very practical book. And some refer to it as the Proverbs of the New Testament. So it's kind of like one saying after another, as it were. You know, like in Proverbs, you got one thought and it goes to the next one, and it's kind of that way in the book of James. I want to say first before we get started, I'm glad that Bill got that screw out. I was telling Lloyd, y'all should have seen that thing. It was, how long was it, Bill? 3 inches or better?
3 1/4. 3 1/4.
3 1/4 inches, and real thick. And that thing was protruding out the back of his heel. And y'all appreciate this, those of you that work with tools and the pliers and things like that. The guy got a pair of, it's almost like vice grips or a pair of pliers on it, and put Bill on his face and just started turning it, like you would trying to get a screw out of something, like that, and got it out. And the nurse cleaned it up for him and gave it to him. So he got a souvenir for
I watched a knee replacement one time on YouTube, and look, one of that carpenter's doing it.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, that's what it looked like. Yeah,
screwdrivers,
Carpenters, plumbers.
yeah.
Yeah, that's what it looked like. Guy that that hammers things and screws things and hangs things on the wall. Somebody's taking it out, to redo it or something. But I'm glad Bill's doing better, and that he got some relief, pain wise and all from that ordeal. As we get into James, I wanted to give a little background information to start with. So I hope it's not real boring, but a little background about the writer, the date of what some think, the date of the writer, of course, and what it's all about, what the book is all about, and so forth and so on. And I've got 3 or 4, as I mentioned, the commentaries to shed a little different light on some of the writing and some of the book. It's not totally settled about which James it was, but most people believe it's kind of come down through the years, through the centuries, that it's James, the half brother of the Lord, who is the writer. Most people agree on that. There are a couple of commentators said there are 3 guys with the 3 guys with the name of James in the New Testament. There's one of them said that there's 4, and I want y'all to see if y'all can find this one for me. But there are, of course, you got James, the brother of John, and because we know it wasn't him that wrote it, because he had already died. Remember, he was put to death there in Acts 12. So it wasn't him. You got James, the son of Alphaeus, one of the apostles. So that was the second one. But he was kind of indistinguishable in a lot of ways. Not much, if anything, said about him. You got James, the Lord's half brother, and then I want y'all to look at this and see if you could tell me what you get out of this. But in Luke, and I've tried and I've looked at it 2 or 3 different ways. and it's got, and maybe I'm just not seeing it, but one of the commentaries said that in Luke 6:16, Luke 6:16 is the other James that's mentioned in the New Testament. And this is James, the father of Judas, not Judas Iscariot, but the other Judas. There were two Judases, or kind of come down to us as Jude. The other one was called Jude a lot. Of course, there was a Jude, the brother of the Lord, which is not this person. So you got Jude. Don't want to confuse you, but you got James that's mentioned in Luke 6:16 as the James that's the father of Jude or Judas. The other Judas that's mentioned in the list of 12 apostles, he's not Judas Iscariot, but he's Judas. But my reading is, and maybe yours says something different, because the translator supplied the words the brother, and Judas, the brother of James, and Judas Iscariot, which also was the traitor. Does your Bible say Judas, the son of James, or how does yours read? The son of James. Yours says the son of James.
New King James.
Yeah.
And Wayne, yours says the son. Okay, that's where it comes from then. And I should have looked it up. I've got a new King James, but I didn't look it up. But the King James says the brother of James. So if you look at it as the son of James, then that's where a couple of the commentators, I think Wayne Jackson and one of the others, mentioned that there are 4 Jameses that are mentioned. This was one of them. This was one of the 4. And so when you're trying to decide which one of the 4 Jameses that wrote the book of James, he would be included in that 4. But again, most all the way back from the earliest times believe it was James, the Lord's half brother. Josephus concurs with that as well, all the way back to the first century or thereabouts. One of the early Jewish historians. So that's the way that people have reasoned it out, that it's James, the Lord's half brother, that wrote the book of James. So
There in chapter 6, after it said Judas, brother of James, but let's see. In verse 15 says, it's named the apostles or disciples. And it says James, the brother of Alphaeus,
yeah,
and Judas, the brother of James. Is that the same James?
now yours says the brother of Alphaeus or the son of Alphaeus?
So, I'm sorry, it says son, I misread it.
Yeah,
It
the
says,
son of Alphaeus, yeah.
But is that the same James in both verses there it's talking about?
No, I don't think so. Let's see. Which one was that, Lord? Luke 6?
Luke 6, 15
Yeah.
and 16.
Let me.
It's just named the disciples.
Yeah,
Comes
named the
Matthew,
10.
Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, and
Yeah,
Simon called.
yeah. So in that list, you had 2 Jameses. You had James, the brother of John, James and John, and then you had another James, James the son of Alphaeus. So that was the second James, and then you had 2 Judases in that list also. Judas, the brother James, or in other places he referred to as Jude. And of course that's different from the Lord's half brother, because he had a half brother also named Jude. James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. The 4 brothers that are named in the Bible, and then of course Judas Iscariot. So you had 2 Judases, 2 Jameses. Trying to think if there was another. I don't think there was another pair like that. But
It mentions James 3 times in that scripture.
oh yeah, you got another Simon also. Simon called Zelotes, and of course Peter was also named Simon. So you had I thought there was another one. So you had 3 Simons, if you want to consider Simon Peter as one of them. Then you got Simon called Zelotes there in verse 15.
Simon called the Zealot.
Yeah, the Zealot. Yeah, the Zealot.
Verse
Yeah,
15.
verse 15. Yeah. So that's, any other thoughts on that particular thing? I just kind of wanted to see it because I should have looked it up, and I thought probably that the words translated the brother there was another translation that said the son of Judah or Judas. So that's where that came from. So that was the four Jameses, but most believe that James, partly because he became a pillar in the church, and you remember early on, go back to John chapter 7 and verse 5, I think, where it said that his brothers didn't believe in him. But then after the resurrection, we know that he appeared at least to James, the one that wrote this book, because in 1 Corinthians 15:7, it talks about it, appearing to James. So, and probably to all of his brothers, but at least in that regard. And he became very prominent, of course, James became very prominent in the church, being one of the leaders in the early church. Matter of fact, and we talked about it way back, but in Acts chapter 15 at the Council of Jerusalem, who was the main spokesman and seemed like the one that was kind of, I don't know if you call it the head of it, but he was very prominent in that council, besides Peter and Paul, of course. But James was very prominent. Matter of fact, he was the one that spoke up first and talked about it and talked about what they were going to do with the circumcision issue and the issue with the Gentiles and so forth and so on. And then, and also, I was going to mention this, also in Galatians chapter 1, it was kind of interesting because in some of the commentators, they were saying, well, it's surprising that he didn't identify himself instead of being a servant of the Lord in James chapter 1, verse 1. Why didn't he say that he was the brother of the Lord? Or why didn't he say he was an apostle? Well, one of the commentators said, well, he wasn't an apostle, but if you look at Galatians chapter 1 verse 19, it says he was an apostle. He wasn't one of the 12, but he was an apostle. Matthias wasn't one of the 12 either, was he? But he was an apostle. He became one of the 12, but he wasn't one of the original 12. And I started looking at that a little bit too, and I was going to ask you guys, maybe you can tell me. I had heard, and I had read somewhere, that there were 17 people named in the New Testament that were actually considered apostles. Of course, we know the original 12, and we know Paul, called to be an apostle. As a matter of fact, he mentions that in 9 of his 13 epistles. So you got Paul, you got Matthias, that's two more. And then in Galatians, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, see if I can find it real quick. Galatians 1 and verse
19 says, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother.
Okay, so what does that tell you?
It says he's one of the apostles.
One of the apostles. So I didn't say any of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So he was considered an apostle at that point in time, not one of the 12, but that would have been at least the 15th one that's named in the New Testament. And I was trying to think of who the other two, and I've looked and looked, but I can't find it. And I can't remember, Keith, maybe you can tell me. I don't know, I can't remember if Barnabas was described as one.
It's referred to on one occasion as an apostle.
As an apostle, yeah, I thought so, and I couldn't spot it right off the bat.
While Christ was still alive, though none of his brothers actually believed that he was the Christ.
That's right. John 7 verse 5 says that. It said, neither did his brothers believe in him. Or he says brethren, but it's his brothers. Absolutely. That's a good point. Did believe in him, and so we know that in 1 Corinthians, and a lot of the commentators believe that this was after Jesus' appearance to James, which Paul records in 1 Corinthians 15, when he's naming all of those that saw him, showing that there was a resurrection of the Christ. When he's mentioned all that, he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. In 1 Corinthians 15, I'm referring to that. He was seen above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain alive at this point. After that, he was seen of James, then of all of the apostles, and last of all, he was seen of me also, as one born out of due time. So he records in 1 Corinthians 15:7 that he was seen of James, then of all the apostles, and so forth. So some believe that after that appearance to James, that's when things turned around for James as far as believing in him, because the Lord said, and I think there was another statement that says about the same thing. I think it's Mark 6 and verse 3, I'm not sure, about James not believing in him and so forth. But I know in John 15, John 7 verse 5, that he didn't believe in him. So, but he was so prominent in the church, and matter of fact, he was described in Galatians 2 and verse 9 as a pillar in the church. And we know, as we mentioned, the big council on circumcision in Jerusalem there in Acts 15, and how prominent he was in settling the issue of circumcision. So other verses that talk about his prominence, let me just we're not going to turn and read them, but Acts 12 verse 17, Acts 15:19, which was the chapter about the council in Jerusalem, Acts 21:18, he's mentioned again. Paul mentions him in Galatians 1:19 as one of the apostles. Galatians 2:9 is one of the pillars in the church, and also Galatians 2 and verse 21. So he is very prominent in the early church at that point in time, and that's quite a remarkable turnaround when you consider that he didn't believe in him at one time. There, as we mentioned, what is stated in the book of John. Also, I want to read just 2 or 3 statements here about James toward the end of his life. It says the New Testament is silent concerning his later history, but Josephus, the Jewish historian, says that shortly before the war that ended in the destruction of Jerusalem, somewhere around AD 63, he said, this is a quote from Josephus, Ananias, the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ, whose name was James, and some of his companions, and delivered them to be stoned. Of course, that's secular history. That's Josephus stating that. The Bible doesn't say exactly what happened to him, but Josephus is making that statement. He said he was allowed to remain out not long before the overthrow of the Jewish state, which we know in AD 70, and was then removed, and then he goes on to something about his life, so forth, so I won't read that. The epistle was almost certainly written at Jerusalem, and probably during the last decade of the life of the writer, in other words, the last decade of his life, that it was addressed to Jewish Christians, those that were scattered abroad. It's not doctrinal, but full of practical instruction in the duties of life. And he mentions here that there was some discussion among the fathers, the early fathers in the church, whether it was entitled to a place in the canon, but those doubts have mainly passed away. I want to read just a couple of things just real quick about that here in just a second. But Wayne Jackson also mentions Josephus, and I don't know if it's pronounced Hegesippus or Hegesippus, places James' death between AD 62 and 68, and Jackson says, hence somewhere in this general time frame the epistle may have been written. Perhaps most authorities lean toward the earlier date, somewhere around AD 62, that it was written. It seems certain that it was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, perhaps around AD 62 or thereabouts. And some conservative scholars date the book as early as AD 46 or 49, which would possibly make it the earliest of the New Testament books. And there's quite a discussion about that. I'm going to read something about that here in just a second, about whether it was, not that it mattered, but it just trying to get a context about when it might have been written. I believe it was James, the Lord's half-brother. He could have written it as late as AD 62 or thereabouts, or as early as maybe 46 or 47 AD. And that was kind of interesting to me, because the same argument about the early date or the later date was made in Nelson's commentary, and here's what he says about it. He says, the date of writing proposed is either early or late, and, ironically, for the same reason. The epistle's apparent contrast to Pauline theology. To those who argue for a late date, in other words, he wrote around AD 62, basically says this, that Paul's justification by faith had been abused. You know, Paul said we're justified by faith. James said we're justified by what? Works. So there's where the seeming conflict is in the religious world, that one said one thing, one said the other, so there's a conflict. So do we include it in the canon or not? Do we put it in there? When was it written? If Paul said it was justified, if Paul said it was justified by, we're justified by faith, and James comes along later, like AD 62, and says that we're justified by works, since there's a conflict, we can't include James in the canon because he conflicts with what Paul said. So there was a difference of opinion by some of the early first century people as to when it was written because of that. But let me just continue just a second. I know y'all may have a thought about that. Paul's justification by faith had been abused and exaggerated, resulting in the neglect of Christian service. In other words, if it's by faith, why do we need to do anything? Okay? Why do we need to do anything? If it's by faith, okay, it's by faith. It's not, you can't include works. Accordingly, James refutes perversions of this doctrine. Others, contending that he wrote before Paul, explain that his aim centered around the practical works, the practical works being emphasized. In other words, if it's a practical thing, works being emphasized. That being the case, a need still existed for a clear exposition of justification, which, of course, was accomplished by Paul. So in other words, what he's saying here is that if James wrote early, then when James wrote after him, that, well, let me read that again. That being the case, a need still existed for a clear exposition of justification, which of course was accomplished by Paul. So if James wrote early in 46 or 47 AD, then Paul wrote a little later to really explain what James is saying. If it was the other way around, then the other one wrote to explain what the other one said. You see what they're saying? So in other words, it's saying that there's no conflict between Paul and James about how we're justified. So he says another indication of an early date is found in James 2 and verse 2, where the assembly mentioned is actually synagogue, the place commonly used for worship in the earliest years of Christianity. The epistle probably was written in the middle 40s, according to Nelson's commentary, prior to the council at Jerusalem, which dates around AD 49 or 50. So he says that, so you got two schools of thought, and I don't know which is which, that he could have been written in the mid-40s, could be written in the early 60s, and Paul and James do not have a conflict over it because they're explaining, in a sense, what the other said. So James is either explaining Paul's justification by faith, or Paul is explaining James' justification by works, and what he said in the various epistles, the various epistles where he talks about how we justify, particularly in Romans, where he mentions a lot of that. Go ahead, Lord, I'm sorry.
Well, neither of those are any good without the other. We know faith without works is dead.
That's right.
Also, a person who does good works but doesn't believe in Jesus, his works don't count for anything either. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, there's neither one you can without the other.
Absolutely. You're exactly right. And that's the reason I wanted to read this one statement, if I can find it real quick. Yeah, here it is. So let me just go back just a second. This is in some of Wayne Jackson's material. Let's read a couple things real quick. He says the book of James was slightly slower in being accepted as part of the canon when it was assembled, due to limited circulation in certain areas of the ancient world. Nonetheless, the evidence for its historical integrity is sufficient to establish its genuineness. In other words, the early writers, you go back into the 200s and the 300s, state that it was in the canon, it should have been in the canon, and I won't go back and read all that, but I got some information on that indicate what different ones said about it. Even Eusebius said there was some doubted it, but it should be included in the things that he said, and some of the early guys in the 200s said that it's quite compelling. Both external and internal evidence is quite compelling, so that no serious rival competes with James, the Lord's half-brother, as the author. In other words, most everybody now agrees, and through the years have agreed, that James, the Lord's half-brother, is the writer. But here's the thing about Luther, Martin Luther, and you'll appreciate this because Keith has mentioned some of these kind of things before about Luther and Calvin and some of the ones that led the religious world off into other things that's anti-Bible. Martin Luther called the document, quote, an epistle of straw, consigning it to an appendix in his 1522 edition of the New Testament, thus leading the Protestant world into a heretical view of God's plan for human redemption, namely that salvation is by, Keith had mentioned this several times before, faith alone. In other words, Luther, I guess probably more than anybody else, that's the reason the religious world in general used the term faith only. How you say faith only? That's what Paul told the Philippian jailer, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. And other verses that point out the same thing, that whosoever, John 3:16, whosoever believed in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. So it's faith only. And so, but Luther made a big deal out of it, and part of the reason that he made the big deal out of it was because, I guess what he took the view, that's the reason I spent a little time on it, that he took the view of Paul, the justification by faith, but Paul didn't say faith only, but we're justified by faith, and Keith has mentioned that several times in the class about in the how to identify the New Testament church, what do we believe, and the steps of salvation and so forth, of what's important. He's done a brilliant job about that, so I'm not going to, I can't steal his thunder, but what I want to say is, it's not by faith only. Matter of fact, the only time faith only is used together is not by faith only, and James uses it. As Lord was mentioning, about faith without works is dead, being alone, and so forth and so on. So that's kind of a little background as to the author, a little bit about what's in the book, a little bit about the date of the writing, and so forth. And in the just a second, Charlie, and I get you. In one of the outlines of James, if you wanted what's in each chapter, chapter 1 is talking about proving faith. Chapter 2, faith and obedience, which the Lord mentioned a while ago. Chapter 3, the unruly tongue, which is the main thrust of chapter 3. Chapter 4, the curse of worldliness, and chapter 5, the value of holiness. And of course, you have a mixture in some of that too, and it looks like, some say it looks a little loose or disjointed, but it's really not. You can say the same thing about Proverbs if you want to look at it that way, because it goes from one topic to another. But James is kind of almost a rapid fire kind of thing in a sense, because you got one command after another, one statement after another, and they don't all necessarily lead into the next thought. Like some of the writers would, over several verses, kind of leading up to a climax as well. Go ahead, Charlie. Sure.
Well, I think you see the first Peter and second Peter said, hope without faith is dead alone, or something like that.
I think James 2, faith without works is dead, being alone. Is that the one you were referring to? Faith without works is dead. There you go. James chapter 2. When we get to that, we'll talk about that quite a bit, because he points out very plainly that you got to have both. Show me your faith without your works. I show you my faith by my works. So, and Joel has talked about that just recently in a sermon or two, and made some really good points in that regard. Okay, anything before we get into it? I want to at least read the 27 verses, and we'll still go back. And it's one of those deals where you can really get bogged down, and I don't want to get totally bogged down, but there a couple of these commentaries made some really good points about what some of these things mean, and I want to spend a little time on them. So sometimes we may get 2 or 3 verses, sometimes we may get 6 or 8 or 10 verses, in a class. But we'll kind of go at the pace that you want to go at, or your comments and your thoughts as you go along, because it's just chock full of things that I think that we can glean a lot from in living the Christian life. I think if you had to sum up one book as to how to live, talks about pure religion, undefiled before God, visit the Father's will as you keep yourself unspotted for the world, in James chapter 1, and the thing about the tongue, the thing about faith and works together, the thing about overcoming the worldliness and problems with the world, and all the things there. And then even in James chapter 5, talking about the prayer life, the effects of fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, and whosoever turns a person away from his sins shall hide a multitude, multitude of sins, cover a multitude of sins, and save a soul from death. And so it's just so much as we go through, and so I think it's just a great book to contemplate and think about.
Yes, I probably ought to know this, but we talked about disciples and apostles a while ago, and Christ named the disciples. We know disciples even when he was a follower of someone else.
Yeah.
Exactly what is the definition of an apostle? Is that just the ones that were able to impart spiritual gifts to someone else?
Yeah, usually the definition, it says the definition is one sent.
One sent.
And a person that's sent to do something. Like
Christ also sent out his disciples to do things.
at 70, right, sent out to 70, right.
They had to
So-
be sent by Jesus, did they not? Become an apostle?
Well, as far as this, just I guess a Webster's definition of an apostle, it wouldn't, but I think in terms of the New Testament, it would. When there was one called an apostle, like Paul, I'm going to show him, he's going to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the Jews and so forth and so on. So as Bill said, he sent him out, kind of like Paul and Barnabas was sent out, and that's the reason I couldn't find anything on Barnabas a while ago. But they were sent out by the church. But Paul was already called an apostle. Paul called to be an apostle and so forth and so on. Because he mentions that in 9 of his 13 epistles. Paul an apostle, or Paul called to be an apostle. And then Barnabas was sent with Paul from the church in Antioch there, and I think I should remember Acts 13, on the first missionary journey. And so he was called an apostle. So he was one of the, now up to 16, and I think there was another one that was considered an apostle. But as Bill was talking about, if you wanted to consider those that Jesus sent out, he sent about 2 and 2, and that was the 70. Was it 70 that was sent out? That went out, and I guess you could consider them, even though most people kind of forget about them. But they were, in other words, it was one or a person sent on a particular mission. It's kind of like, and Keith has mentioned this before, Isaiah 6 and verse 8, here am I, send me, when Isaiah made that statement. Well, the Bible doesn't refer to him as an apostle, but he was willing to go, kind of like we're told, go into all the world, preach the gospel. So we're the legs and the brain and so forth of doing the same kind of thing that Paul and others did, taking the gospel to the world. Of course, we're not referred to as an apostle, but just the definition of just the word itself, a person who is sent on a particular mission to do something. And in the case of Bible apostles, these were the ones that were sent by the Lord, even though Matthias was chosen. Of course, the Lord had something to do with his choosing, but he sent those 12 out different from Matthias. and a little different from Paul itself, even after his resurrection, but he did appear to Paul like he did to those 12. Don't have any indication that he appeared to Matthias, but then the church sent out Barnabas, so that was another one.
Was chosen by casting lots.
Cast a lot, yeah.
Makes the decision.
God kind of oversaw it, right? Absolutely. He oversaw it. Absolutely. So that's kind of the definition of it.
The apostles also had to be a witness.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Had to be a witness. And of course, Matthias was, because the one that had been with him from the beginning. Paul saw him after the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 that we talked about. Last of all, he appeared to me, 1 Corinthians 15:8. So he saw him. So
Disciples were witnesses, but not all disciples.
not all, right. So we're disciples, but we're not apostles.
Right.
So that's kind of a,
I've never really thought about the definition of it seriously.
Yeah. matter of fact, when he appeared to all of them in Galilee, the indication was that there might have been a lot more than just the 12 there, even though we know the 12 appeared, and we talked about that way back. But he appeared, some think that might have been when he appeared to the 500 at once, because it mentions in 1 Corinthians 15 that there were 500 that he appeared to at one time, after the resurrection. So I don't know which 500 that was or what the event was, but the indication was it might have been when he told the apostles to go to this mountain in Galilee after the resurrection. I'm going to appear to you there, and that's when he said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature," and so forth. All the things that he told them on that particular occasion. Let's see if we can at least get it read, and then next week we'll dive into it pretty good. Let's see, Bill, read maybe the first 8 verses. Charlie, read 9 and 10. Keith, let's see, 11 through 14. Wayne, 15 through 19. Scott, 20 through 22, and Lloyd, 23 to 27. We'll see if we can get it read. If we don't, we'll finish it up next week.
I'm reading from the New King James. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways.
I want patience, and I want it now, right, Bill? We want it today, right now. Go ahead, Charlie.
Chapter, verse 8.
Verse 9 and 10.
Oh, verse 7, 9, and 10.
9 and 10, yeah.
For let not the man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. But to brother of low degree rejoicing that he is exalted, but the rich in that he is made low, because as the flower of the grass, they shall pass away.
All right, thank you, Charlie.
For the sun is no sooner risen with the burning heat, but it withereth the grass, and the flower thereof falleth, and the grace and the fashion of it perisheth. So also shall the rich man fade away in his ways. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed.
Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. Be not deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Therefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be slow to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath.
For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Therefore lay apart all filthiness and superfluity
Fluidity?
of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your souls. But be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves.
Well, Lord, they left you out.
For if any man be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. But whosoever looketh into the perfect law of liberty, and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed. If any man among you seem to be religious, and bridleth not his tongue, but deceiveth his own heart, this man's religious is vain. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world.
All right, thank you, guys, appreciate that. We'll get into the text next week, and I think it'll be a good study for us. If I could do a decent job, it'll be a good study for us. So appreciate you guys' patience. We'll be giving a little background information, but we'll get in the text next week. Thank you.